Hello, very good evening. Welcome to LBC's weekly political panel debate show, Cross Question. Remember, you can watch us on Global Player, the LBC YouTube channel, Facebook page or Twitter feed. Joining me on the panel today are Sarah Olney, Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park and Liberal Democrat Business and Transport spokeswoman, Lord Falconer, Shadow Attorney General, Labour peer, Liz Saville Roberts, who is Plaid Cymru's Westminster leader and MP for a constituency which I will no doubt mispronounce. She can correct me in a minute. Dwyfor Meirionnydd. That's the best I can do. Ghani is Conservative MP for Wealdon and a former Transport Minister. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. You can tweet us at LBC or at Iain Dale. And, of course, you can text us on 84850.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Brendan in Hartlepool. Important place. Brendan, what would you like to ask?
Good evening. I would like to ask the panel, what do they think would be the consequences for Mr Starmer if he loses this long-standing Labour seat in Hartlepool tomorrow?
What would be Keir Starmer's prospects if Labour lose the Hartlepool by-election tomorrow? It's a question I can't really believe I'm asking, because only twice in the last 60 years, I think, has the governing party won a seat from the opposition. Charlie Falconer, I have to come to you first on this, obviously.
Well, I don't know what's going to happen in Hartlepool in the by-election. If you look at the figures in 2019, we had something like 34% of the vote, and Brexit got more votes than our majority. I've been up to Hartlepool. I've been struck by perhaps two things. First of all, the voters in Hartlepool are very aware that there's been a change of leadership in the Labour Party. They know Jeremy Corbyn is gone and somebody else has taken over, Keir Starmer. And secondly, the biggest thing that people are interested in on the doorstep is COVID and what's going to happen. There's never been a period of time in people's experience where what the government decides has such an immediate and direct effect on their lives. It's a very unusual time for there to be these elections. We've obviously got to learn whatever lessons come, including if we lose the seat. But I don't want to speculate on what the result will be. I from quite a considerable experience of being at the doorstep during elections, general elections, local elections and by-elections, this is a very, very unusual period and a very unusual by-election.
Well, I completely understand why you don't want to predict a Labour defeat. That would be quite remarkable if you did. But, there are... If Labour didn't win it, if maybe they came third in Scotland again and then didn't win the West Midlands seat, would you accept, though, that there'll be lots of questions that the party has to answer?
Well, there are going to be lots of questions, whatever the result is. The key thing, I think, is to listen to what people are saying. It's very difficult to form general conclusions about which way politics are going to go when you're having these 2 years' worth of elections crammed into one day, where the government's position, and indeed I suspect this reflects governments all over the world, is primarily reflected by what the population is feeling on a day-to-day basis, which is almost exclusively about COVID. It's very difficult, for example, to reach conclusions about what happens to the centre-left throughout Europe when there's a COVID election going on. And that's what's happening at the moment.
Liz Saville Roberts, I don't know how familiar you are with what's happening in Hartlepool, but let's also ask you about what's happening in Wales as well, because Labour have been in government in Wales ever since the beginning. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow, apart from Plaid Cymru doing fantastically well, which we take as read?
Thank you for saving me saying that, and I'm sure we will. It's been an extraordinary election. I mean, to be out on the streets, in recent weeks, and to try and get a real sense of what's happening. I mean, we haven't got the data in the sense that we would normally have, and I imagine that Hartlepool's going to be different as a by-election. But as you said, Iain, Labour have been in power in Wales for 22 years, and there is a different dynamic between Wales and what's happening, I think, in the many, many elections in England as well. But nonetheless, there is that sense that things are running out of time and running out of energy, and that people do want something differently. Now, of course, with COVID, we've had a different scenario playing out in Wales as well. People's experience of that has been somewhat different. But we shall see. I'm not going to make any predictions either, not that surprisingly, for this weekend. But I think we're going to have a very interesting series of conversations about how this plays out in future. And really interesting, people are aware that we've done things in different ways in Wales, not just the government, right down to the community. There's a different set of values in operation. And that opens a whole lot of conversations.
Well, it does indeed, but why haven't Plaid made the breakthrough in Wales that the SNP have in Scotland? What's the difference?
They're different countries with different backgrounds and different institutions. But the one thing that I would say about Plaid is the very fact that we have what is now a Senedd that has been there for 22 years, previously as an assembly. When Plaid did work with Labour back 2 parliaments ago, we then brought in extra lawmaking powers. So the powers that we have in Wales, it's been Plaid Cymru that has been the catalyst for those. And I do imagine, and I frankly relish the role of being the catalyst for further changes in future.
And just remind me how to pronounce your constituency.
Dwyfor Meirionnydd.
I wasn't that off, was I? I don't think. Now, yesterday I interviewed the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, who did give me predictions about what she thought was going to happen in Scotland. I failed to get predictions out of Liz and Charlie. Sarah Olney, how well are the Liberal Democrats going to do?
Well, we're looking forward to tomorrow. We do really enjoy elections, and it's been fantastic over the last few weeks to get back out onto the doorsteps, because of course we haven't been able to do that in nearly a year. And it has been really, really good to be able to reconnect with voters again up and down the country and talk to them about their concerns, particularly after the year we've all had. It's been very difficult. Everyone has had a really traumatic and disrupted year, and obviously it's interesting to talk to them about what impact that's had on them. But obviously I think that's why people are being very cagey about making predictions, because we just don't know how that's going to have impacted their voting intentions. But we're hoping to make progress across the country in a number of different contests.
Can you agree with me that you're not going to win in Hartlepool, given the last poll put you at 1%?
We have an excellent local candidate there, Andy Hagon, who is born in the constituency.
Well, he's not doing very well, is he?
But we have no particular skin in the game in Hartlepool, and I think we do that from the start.
Well, you say that, but actually the Liberal Democrats won Redcar, which is not that far away from Hartlepool, in the not too distant past. And you've always been really good at by-elections. Why have you lost that art at winning by-elections?
Well, as a by-election survivor here, I can tell you it very much depends on the seat. Obviously, Richmond Park was a stunning success for us 4.5 years ago.
You're obviously a much better candidate than your Hartlepool guy.
Well, I think it's partly, sometimes by-elections can be a reflection of national issues, and sometimes they can be a reflection of much more local issues. You're right, we do have quite a big presence up in the northeast, with a main opposition on Newcastle City Council, for example. We run Redcar District Council, as you just said. So, we do have more presence up there than people might think. But I think it very much depends the different dynamics of different seats. Sometimes it's really worth us, sometimes where we're second, or we think that the demographics suit us, we'll really pull out the stops and really see what can be done. I think we always suffer from not having as much of a national profile as the Conservatives and Labour. So, but when we decide to go for a seat, we really put our heart and soul into it, and that's what really makes the difference. It's not just the candidate.
Now, because, Sarah, you committed the cardinal sin of mentioning your candidate's name, I now have to read out all of the other candidates' names for Hartlepool. So have a little cup of tea while I do this. The other candidates in Hartlepool are the SDP, David Bettany, Monster Raving Looney, the Incredible Flying Brick, North East, Hilton Dawson, Women's Equality Party, Gemma Evans, Green Party, Rachel Featherstone, Independent, Adam Gaines, Liberal Democrat, we know, Andrew Hagan, Freedom Alliance, Steve Jack, Independent, Chris Killick, Independent, Sam Lee, Heritage Party, Claire Martin, Conservative Party, Jill Mortimer, Reform UK, John Prescott, no, not that one, Independent, Thelma Walker, and another Independent, W. Ralph Wall Jackson, and Labour, Paul Williams. Phew, got to the end of it. Ghani, what are Conservative expectations in Hartlepool?
I was going to be in complete contrast to Sarah and say, I'm going to break ranks and be very cautiously optimistic. Is that good enough for me, or am I going too far already?
Well, I think to be fair, Liz was quite cautiously optimistic too. So you're not breaking ranks by saying that.
What's Liz? Oh, no. Well, there we are. But I think, God, I don't want to jinx it, but and obviously don't want to take any vote for granted. But the mood is good. The mood is good, and I don't think it's just about what we're doing nationally down in Westminster. But I think the one thing that we're sort of overlooking is the phenomenal success of some of our mayoral candidates, and the fact that they've been able just to deliver locally or regionally, and that's providing people with a sense of optimism. And you can vote for a candidate.
And let's not name any of them, please.
I won't name them, but the point I was trying to land is that that's been really good for us. So when you've got really good Conservative mayoral candidate, it reflects really well on voting Conservative for a member of Parliament too. And I think the other peculiar thing about this election has been how the Labour Party has constantly have to have this narrative about how care is different to the previous leader, instead of actually talking about what it can deliver on the ground, for example. So the conversation is always about.
Well, come on. You would do exactly the same, wouldn't you? Frankly, I mean, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they say that?
And you've got a Super Thursday. People really want to hear what you're going to deliver, not have to spend 5 minutes listening to how you're different to the last person in post that delivered, not a great success for the Labour Party. So that's a bit of an issue, I think. And I think a lot of working class voters just feel they've been taken for granted by the Labour Party, and they want people that are going to deliver for them. And they know that with the positive experience from a mayoral candidate and also the optimism of the Prime Minister, there's probably a better place to deliver them success going forward.
Just on the Prime Minister, are you not worried by some of the polls over the last few days that show that the Tory support has declined, and that can only be put down to all of the different allegations that have been made against the Prime Minister over the past couple of weeks? Is that not beginning to filter through in the polls?
Until the votes are counted and done, everyone's going to be anxious. It doesn't matter, where you are in the polls for any seat. Nobody, sleeps well until they are declared either the winner, and unfortunately those people have to go home as losers. But I get very limited people trying to talk to me about what they think are the issues that SW1 want us to obsess over. People want to talk about vaccinations, which have gone down incredibly well. What's going to happen next, what's going to happen with job security. This is what matters to them. People aren't really talking about the Prime Minister and everything else that the newspapers want us to be discussing all the time.
The Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross on Andrew Marr on Monday said that he thought the Prime Minister should resign if he's broken the ministerial code. Last night I had Donald Cameron, the Conservative health spokesman, on the programme. He said exactly the same. Would you agree with them?
Look, I think there are 3 inquiries now set up to investigate all of this. So let's just see how this all comes out at the end. But no one's talking about this. I mean, I'm not very far from you. I'm over in East Sussex, and we've been banging or knocking on doors trying to get people to talk to us about the election. It's not being raised at all. Honestly, it really is about COVID.
I don't believe it's not being raised at all. But I mean, you haven't answered the question. If he's been found to have broken the ministerial code, do you think he would then have to resign? Because that's what would normally happen if a minister breaks the ministerial code.
Well, he'll have to come to a decision. Well, he'll have to deal with that when it comes about.
But what would your advice be?
All of these 3 different. Well, I'm sure the Prime Minister can get advice far more senior than myself.
I'd just like to hear your view.
That is my view. We'll see what the inquiries throw up.
OK, I don't think I'm going to get an answer on that, am I? Right, we will move on and take more questions in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. If you'd like to ask my panel a question, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
Elections 2021. Follow the results as they happen this Friday and across the weekend on LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 18 minutes past 8. This is not a question from a listener, but it's news that's just breaking. I don't know if you've all seen the report today that the French government have threatened to cut off electricity supplies to Jersey over a fishing dispute over the Brexit agreement. Well, it's just according to the political editor of the Times, Stephen Swinford, Boris Johnson has sent 2 Royal Navy offshore patrol vessels to Jersey because of concerns over the threat of a blockade by French fishermen. The PM and Jersey Chief Minister have agreed the move as a precautionary measure. Ghani, you were the Minister for Shipping at one point, weren't you? I suppose there's a tendentious link there. What's your reaction to this news?
That's quite extraordinary. I can't believe the French are pushing this all this way. I'm not sure what's happening in France right now that they need to try and assert this for any sort of national gain. But you've just told me this is what the Prime Minister has done. So it'll be interesting to see what comes next from the French. This is an extraordinary way for the French to behave. I'd heard that they were threatening all sorts of nonsense, but I can't believe that they would have pushed it any further. But it'll be curious to see how this plays out.
Sarah Olney.
I don't know much about this, I'm afraid, so I don't feel I can comment fully. But I think this is part of what many of us were concerned about with the trade and cooperation agreement that was signed in a rush at the end of last year, without MPs having time to properly scrutinise it. And many of us were saying at the time that there would be lots of consequences and lots of elements of it that we wouldn't be able to necessarily, predict. So I can't honestly say, because I don't know enough about this particular dispute to say to what extent the TCA has played a role in this. But certainly the trade agreement was rushed. We haven't had time to scrutinise it properly. I think that these are presumably, probably, possibly some of the consequences coming home to roost right now. It does seem, I have to say, an extraordinary escalation to be sending ships. There must surely be a diplomatic solution to this, and I can't see how escalating it like this is going to...
It's extraordinary to threaten to cut off electricity, isn't it? No,
I don't disagree, but nevertheless, I feel certain there must be a diplomatic route to resolving this, and that sending ships is an escalation also that we don't need.
No, I don't know how to put this diplomatically to you, Sarah, but according to your Twitter account, according to my friend Matthew, you think you're appearing on a show called Cross Section. Cross Question.
I will I'll get that corrected, sorry.
Charlie Falconer, a good bit of gunboat diplomacy the day before elections. That's going to go down well with a lot of people, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, the first point, I completely agree with you, Iain. The threat from the French to cut off the electricity to Jersey is so disproportionate as a response and is awful, I think. I don't know how. I mean, I am told that threat is sourced to the French government, and it is terrible. In relation to the 2 British Navy vessels that have been sent to Jersey, I don't know if that's a response to what French fisher boats are about to do as opposed to the French government. And it's impossible to judge on the basis of what you've said whether it's a proportionate or disproportionate response. But if there's a genuine threat to blockading the port of Jersey or Guernsey, then it might be proportionate. But one of the things that's been done is that quite complex arrangements have been set up under the Trade Cooperation Agreement. I don't know whether or not, whatever arrangement has been set up, there'll be tensions about fishing. But obviously, rather than blockading Jersey and Guernsey and having to send British naval vessels, obviously the right course is trying to resolve it through those arrangements that have been set up. Long term into the future, we're out of Europe now. That decision has been made, and we should stick to that decision. But we've set up structures, and it's for the government to give the clearest possible message that we should use those structures to resolve those sorts of disputes.
But Charlie, when you've got governments acting in national interest, playing to a local audience, the French threat on cutting electricity, we can't be we're acting as though that we're dealing with people that are going to be mature on all sides, and that definitely isn't the case when it comes to French. And a lot of emotions are involved when it comes to fishing rights as well.
All that's not inaccurate, but ultimately we have to reach solutions long term. I completely agree with you that the threat to cut electricity is completely disproportionate.
Just before I come to Liz, Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun, latest from the Channel, he headlines his tweet. A Downing Street spokesperson has just said this. This evening, the Prime Minister spoke to the Chief Minister of Jersey, Senator John Le Fondre, and the Minister of External Affairs, Ian Gorst, about the prospect of a blockade of St Helier. The Prime Minister and Chief Minister stressed the urgent need for de-escalation of tensions and for dialogue between Jersey and France on fishing access. The Prime Minister underlined his unwavering support for Jersey. He said any blockade would be completely unjustified. As a precautionary measure, the UK would be sending 2 offshore patrol vessels to monitor the situation. They agreed the UK and Jersey governments would continue to work closely on this issue. Well, de-escalation and then sending 2 patrol boats in, do those 2 things really match, Liz?
It just sounds... I mean, forgive me, there is something that's rather... we're responding on the hoof here, which, without knowing all the details, obviously, even though we've had that little bit more... It does seem on the both hand, though, that this is posturing on both sides. A blockade on the one side and a threat to electricity supplies on the other. Alongside this, there should be proper structures in place to discuss this.
Those 2 threats are coming from the same side. Yep. Liz, those 2 threats are coming from the French.
But nonetheless, then to be sending over some form of naval backup, again, this is disproportionate. There should be proper structures in place to be discussing the nature of the relationship with fishing between France and the UK. This was always flagged up throughout Brexit. Just as an aside, nothing about fishing has been sorted. We know that now that UK fishing boats don't have access into Norwegian waters, and I have got shellfish and seafood producers here who can't sell a thing, with no prospect of being able to sell a thing. We've had too long of governments, the UK government, posturing that everything is fine with Brexit, and then using this, a couple of days before an election, to send something out that pleases the Sun. It's shameful.
So you think it is a calculated political move on the part of the Prime Minister, nothing really to do with the issue?
I think the Prime Minister is taking the opportunity to say something that appeals to a certain sort of audience. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem in relation to fishing.
What kind of audience
in relation
is that?
with France and the UK, with access to waters, which was entirely predictable. And alongside that, we have UK fishing people who can't sell their produce, with no prospect of being able to sell their produce.
You said it appeals to a certain type of audience. What type of audience do you mean?
I think the Prime Minister would be better to engage with diplomatic methods of solving these problems, which are not going to go away overnight. This one short-term solution is not going to solve the relationship
but you said
with fishing and France,
you said a certain type of audience
with the Channel Islands into the future.
I'm trying to get at what kind of audience you meant by that remark.
We are in the day before an election.
Okay. Let's go to another question. Zishan is in Ilford. Hello, Zishan.
Hi, good evening. Given the critical situation in India with COVID and the fact that India is not a G7 member, don't you think inviting delegates from India to this summit is probably a mistake in desperation to try and broker trade deals, as Boris's visit had to be cancelled last minute?
Well, the G7 summit has been in the diary for a very long time, hasn't it? Sarah Olney, what do you think?
Well, obviously, as we've seen, some of the delegation have now had to self-isolate because of COVID. And I think actually this really does go to the heart of kind of the current debate about borders and what precautions we need to be taking. There's obviously pressure on the one hand to reopen our borders and to, get life back to normal and to be able to travel abroad this summer. But at the same time, we do need to really think about what the risks are. I think it would have been sensible, given the situation in India at the moment, and we've all seen on the news the really dreadful news reports from the hospitals in India. So we know how bad it is over there. I think it would have been sensible. I absolutely want to have, obviously, India at the table at these discussions, but we've all got much more used to doing things on Zoom over the last year, as we are right now. And we know it's possible. We know that a reasonable dialogue can be had over Zoom. I think it would have been more sensible to have allowed them to participate remotely.
Ghani?
I think just having the core G7 members makes it quite narrow, and the Foreign Secretary said that every precaution was taken, but unfortunately, we've got people, the Indian delegation testing positive for COVID. But I think one of the big things that's going to be debated at G7 is what do we do? How do we ensure that the vaccine is made available to lots of countries around the world? And considering that India is a major manufacturer, I think they probably felt that being there around the table was going to give them a better quality of dialogue. And it's quite difficult doing it on Zoom. And we do need to have a bigger conversation about how we make the vaccine available, which isn't just about financing it, but how do we enable the sort of the ingredients of the vaccine available so it can be produced as it was on HIV, to have it made sure it was available around the world as quickly as possible. And I assume that they felt that they just had to be there to be a part of that conversation. But we've got a huge issue because we've got G7 and COP coming up, which is a big thing for us, a big thing for our country. And we want to be there performing on the national stage. And even though there may be an argument about how do we do this sort of a bit virtual, a bit physical, but it's not going to have the same impact. So how do we make the most of not only ensuring that we're doing good things for our country, but also sort of supporting those areas where COP and G7 are taking place? Because the huge inward investment that comes in as well, it's going to be a tricky decision to make if we have both of these major events being virtual going forward. So it's a bit of a problem. But I think we need to have more than just the core players involved at a discussion when we're dealing with global issues. So that's probably what India was there in person.
Well, I had an email the other day saying, I hope on Cross Question you're never going to have those awful politicians back in the studio with you, Iain. They're much better kept at a distance on Zoom. And I said, no, I look forward to the day when everybody's back in the studio. It's not going to happen until June the 21st, though, I'm afraid. Liz Saville-Roberts, your view, should the Indian delegation have even been invited to the G7 in person?
I think the point about Zoom in the here and now, we're obviously at a time where we're trying to do things in a different way, and I think it was the regular testing that also recognised that some people had been, were carrying the infection. So we're learning, and we do need to learn and try different ways before we can actually throw everything open and be go back to how we were. So I think, to be fair, the process and how this was handled, I admire the fact that it was trying to do something in a different way. And I think it has worked and it has caught people, it's recognised people, and now it's possible to contribute in another way. I think, as Naz said, I think that actually what is being discussed is really important. I think you're touching upon the idea of a temporary waiver on intellectual property, on the patents, is something we really need to be thinking about. I mean, just as an aside, forgive me, but we've heard this week that foreign aid to be cut, I think 95% for polio vaccinations by the Foreign Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister. This is not really perhaps the right time for us to be making these sort of cuts. Also 25% cuts to women and girls' education. This isn't the time, if we're talking about global Britain, to be making these cuts in the here and now. I think we can't be praising ourselves for things that the government is then cutting. And I would like to, perhaps for us to discuss that as much as we're discussing who can be present and how.
Charlie, very briefly, if you would.
Yes, I do think it was right to invite the Indian delegation in person. I do think that the British government looked like they took the appropriate measures in relation to testing. I do think it's important to keep our borders closed until it's safe, but that should be subject to exceptions like inviting high representatives of the Indian government to discuss issues that are so important to India at the moment as it goes through what is a terrible travail with COVID. So I do not criticise the British government for doing it, and I agree with what Nuz said, that it would probably have been far better that they were there in person. And again, as I think it was Liz or Sarah said, the testing regime may well have worked. Could I also very support what Liz has just said about the way that we're demeaning ourselves in the world by reducing the amount of aid that we are giving? It is such a significant source of soft power for the United Kingdom, and for us to be cutting it at this moment is such a mistake, both at a moral and at a strength of Britain throughout the world level.
Well, I was nodding my head in agreement with both of you there, which I shouldn't do as an impartial host, but I don't regret it. Anyway, you see, I can say that on LBC. I couldn't if I was on the BBC, could I? Right, we are going to take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:33, time for the LBC News headlines with Serena Farrow.
On their last meeting today, foreign ministers from the G7 group have committed to working with industry to expand the production of affordable coronavirus vaccines. They also agreed to further increase efforts to support access for people in need while working on licensing, technology and know-how transfers. Police in Kent have tested the dog of a murdered community support officer for possible DNA evidence. Detectives haven't yet identified a motive or any suspects over the death of Julia James last Tuesday. And Donald Trump's described as a total disgrace the decision to uphold a ban on his Facebook account. The social media firm's oversight board says the suspension, which was imposed in January, should be reviewed in 6 months. LBC weather showers, but dying out later on tonight. Rain affecting northern Scotland and the far south of England. A low of -1 degree.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:38 on LBC. Let me reintroduce my panel. Ghani is Conservative MP for Wealdon, former Transport Minister. Liz Saville-Roberts, Plaid Cymru Westminster leader and MP for Dwyfor Meirioneth. Lord Falconer is Shadow Attorney General for the Labour Party, and Sarah Olney is Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park and their Business and Transport spokesperson. Right, next question is from Simon in Southampton. Hi, Simon.
Sevenoaks, actually, Ian, and a pleasure as always.
Sevenoaks, OK. I don't know how we got Southampton, but there we go. What would you like to ask?
Firstly, can I just say I commend the government's actions in dispatching 2 warships to protect British sovereign territory when
they're not. I hate to disappoint you, Simon. I hate to disappoint you. They're not warships. They're patrol boats.
They're still warships. They're Royal Navy commissioned vessels. Okay. They're river-class patrol vessels.
All right, what's your question?
But that's debatable.
All right, what's your question?
But that aside, talking of defence of the realm, with the collapse of the trial against former paratroopers A and C in Belfast this week, concerning the murder of the terrorist McGann, is it not time that we draw a line under the Troubles and that the letters of comfort and pardons that were issued to loyalists and Republican terrorists are extended to British Forces security personnel?
OK. Charlie Falconer, Shadow Attorney General. I mean, this is a legal nightmare, isn't it, in many ways? What's your view?
I mean, it is a legal nightmare. We don't have any limitation period on crime. If the evidence is there, which shows there's a more than 50% chance of a conviction, then charges should be brought. It looks like the charges should not have been brought in the cases that that has been mentioned by the caller, because the trial collapsed pretty quickly on the basis that the judge regarded the main piece of evidence as unreliable. In those circumstances, I don't think people 50 years later should be put through a trial that is going to collapse almost at the first contact with the evidence. But I think as a matter of principle, it is wrong that people can think if a certain number of years go by, they're safe from prosecutions. The answer to the problems is things should be investigated at the time properly. And if there's no evidence of sufficient to justify a crime, then that should be the end of it, unless new and very compelling evidence comes through. That didn't happen in relation to the events around the Troubles. I'm afraid I don't agree with there being any limitation period. It is a price we pay for a free society, but I'm very sure that charges should now, 50 years later, only be brought where there is a very strong chance of conviction.
Do you think that there was too much politics involved in this, and that the prosecuting authorities felt they had to go ahead for maybe presentational or political reasons, rather than because there was a very strong legal case, which clearly there wasn't?
Well, if it was done on the basis of politics, that is just as undermining for the justice system as it is if we drop charges because politics demand that they be dropped. You've got to have absolute confidence that decisions are being made on prosecutions on a purely evidence basis and not a political basis. And I've had real concerns about this government's attitude towards prosecutions, where the Attorney General had previously proved not to be independent in relation to it. If the charges were brought for political reasons, that is deplorable. I don't know whether that's right or whether that's wrong. The important thing is that people have confidence they're being brought on an evidence basis, not a political basis. But as I say, you can't say that because a certain amount of time has passed, people are free forever from prosecution.
Ghani, your colleague Johnny Mercer resigned as Veterans Minister over issues related to all of this. There is no ideal answer here, is there? I mean, you can see from the family members of the man that was killed, you can see why they want answers. But on the other hand, you can see it perfectly well from the soldiers' point of view, that to rake this up after so long, when there's obviously it's turned out not the evidence, that's not the ideal situation either.
But Ian, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like, where was the evidence to bring back these cases. And I think my concern is that we just can't have endless cycles of repeated investigations. At some point, we have to say enough. And if there isn't any further evidence, how are these cases being brought forward? And, we've got people of an extremely, senior age having to go through the process again and again and again. At some point, we need to, put a stop to this. And I'm told that there's going to be detailed legislation coming forward to try and deal with a lot of this, and it can't come soon enough, because I don't think it helps anybody at all when the cases can't even be dealt with appropriately because there isn't enough evidence for the case to be dealt with. And I think it's just doing more harm than good. So we just need. I just think we need to just somehow end this cycle of continued investigations. Because there isn't enough evidence to take it forward. I was curious when Charlie said that we have to have cases open. But Charlie, we get to a point where there obviously wasn't any more evidence for this case to proceed. But yet, individuals are constantly under threat that a case is going to be brought at any point.
Well, so how do you deal with this? The Saville inquiry produced masses of new forensic evidence about what happened on Bloody Sunday. The case that Iain's referring to is not about Bloody Sunday, but there will be cases. That was as a result of the most inadequate investigations in the immediate aftermath of Bloody Sunday, in particular by Lord Ridgely, the Lord Chief Justice. When there was a proper inquiry, years and years later, which was an entirely legitimate thing for the British state to do, because they had offered such an inadequate inquiry before, if the new evidence, which comes years later, produces strong new evidence that would justify a criminal trial, you shouldn't say no to a new criminal trial. And I completely understand what you're saying about the pressure on the soldiers, and that it should have been properly investigated at the time. But Iain is right to point to the victims, and Bloody Sunday is a very good example of this. They too have been looking for justice over a very long period of time, and you cannot close your eyes to what new evidence is produced. The key thing is proper investigations as soon as possible after events like that.
Liz Saville Roberts, Simon on Twitter he says Charlie is disputable. I'm not sure that's an adjective he's ever held against him before, but there we are. He says this isn't a question of statute of limitations. This is a question of known criminals in the IRA being given a free pass and soldiers not. Do you have any sympathy with that point of view?
One thing that I would like to say, and I really appreciate what Lord Falconer has said, because I think that he is certainly way more experienced than I am in discussing these matters. But as things stand, all these people are British citizens, and they all deserve, therefore, to be treated by the best justice, because they are citizens of the British state that the British state can provide.
Okay, Sarah Olney, briefly as well, if you could.
I just think as a general principle, no criminal should ever be beyond the reach of the law. I was just listening very carefully to what Lord Falconer was saying, that he has a great deal more understanding of the particular situation than I do. But it certainly seems to me that we obviously need to proceed with caution and proceed with care and with due respect to both sides. But if there is evidence, then we should pursue that evidence where it leads. But I can't understand why these trials collapsed last week, why they were ever brought if the evidence wasn't strong enough in the first place.
Just before we go to break, and going back to the story about Jersey and France, there's a new hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Je suis Jersey. And also, someone on Twitter says that Boris Johnson sending patrol vessels will mean France surrendering by Friday. Harsh. It's 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Sarah Olney, Charlie Faulkner, Liz Saville Roberts and Ghani with me until 9. Let's go to Mark in Sevenoaks. That's the second call from Sevenoaks we've had tonight. It's the Sevenoaks Massive. Mark, what would you like to ask?
Right. Should consumer law protect homeowners who've bought flats with flammable cladding?
Ooh, now that's a big question, isn't it? I don't know which of you three MPs have got most flats with flammable cladding in your constituencies. I would venture to suggest, Sarah, only that it might be you.
It could well be me. I don't know how much of it is flammable, but certainly I have flats with cladding, and I certainly do have constituents who have been very seriously affected by this issue. It's an absolute scandal, just is the first thing to say. It's really quite mind-blowing that we've even got here, because how we could have so many buildings with dangerous materials stuck on the side of them, and it's not just cladding, it's insulation as well. It's just completely extraordinary. But now that we are here, it is extremely difficult to work out how we move forward, because there's no doubt that at some point you could say that those companies who are producing it are possibly responsible, but there's no way they would have the financial resources to remediate everywhere. It's absolutely essential that the government step in and do far more than they've currently committed to doing. The Lib Dems at every stage of the way were trying to get the fire safety bill that's just passed amended to get the government to do more, because we have so many thousands of people, possibly hundreds of thousands of people stuck in these unsafe flats. They're unable to sell them, and they cannot afford the bills they're being presented with to remediate. It is an absolute scandal, and the government really must do more.
Right, again, I'll ask for relatively brief answers so I can fit in one more question before we finish. Ghani.
I don't have a huge amount of constituents involved in this, but I do actually have lots of friends and family who live in far more urban areas who've been caught up with this, and it's been incredibly stressful for them, because they're anxious about the values of their homes and if there's any way that they're able to sell them, move on to the next property. I think the government has tried to do its best, but we need to come up with a stronger solution that puts a greater pressure on the builders of these apartments to take the pressure off the actual homeowners. My biggest concern is that for a lot of people, buying an apartment is their first step on the housing ladder, and if it's going to be the final step, then it's not going to be helping anybody. So I think there's a bit more work to do herein.
Liz, is this a big problem in your area?
I don't think that I actually have a single instance of this, which is fortunate for the area, but I do know people who live in them. It just seems to be one of those situations that where we know that builders can walk away from these, they can cease to trade. Insurance companies obviously haven't been picking this up. It does seem that only central government really can find some sort of resolution to this, because for the people involved with it, it is an absolute nightmare. They're afraid of the flat that they live in, they're afraid for their safety, and they can't sell it, and they can't afford the costs that are being levied on them.
Charlie, is the only way through this for the government to come up with the money to compensate people? Because it's not their fault. It is clearly the fault of the builders who put the wrong cladding on, but they will say, well, we were only operating under the regulations that existed at the time. This is one of those almost insoluble problems, isn't it?
Well, it's not insoluble. The solution is exactly as you say. The government has got to come up with a scheme that properly compensates people who are completely innocent in this. They didn't know that the cladding would make their homes unsellable. The reason that it is such a systemic problem is because there was such a massive failure of government regulation. The individual tragedies of people who are affected by this is huge. Their future is completely blighted by buying a property that they now cannot sell. I completely agree with Sarah that the government has got to come up with a solution which is equitable, which does try to get recovery from those who produce the cladding, but they'll never be able to produce enough money. If the government come up with that solution, the consequence will be that a lot of people's homes will be revalued, and it will not cost the nation as much as the face value. So they should do it, and my goodness me, they should do it quickly. And I cannot understand why the government have come up with a partial solution, not a complete solution, because they've left out of the solution thousands of people who own flats affected by cladding for reasons that remain completely mysterious, both as a matter of fairness and as a matter of economics.
Mark in Sevenoaks, how would you answer your own question?
Well, I think that the consumers here are the ones that are completely blameless. The government should have indemnified them from the start and then sorted out who pays for it later. There are various types of professionals involved, including the government itself with its regulation. And so I think that in the end, the government needs to be the backstop here. Whether they can blame any other professionals is another matter, but it certainly should have from the beginning been the case that the consumers in this issue should have been protected.
OK, Mark, thank you very much. That's Mark in Sevenoaks. Chris is not in Sevenoaks, unusually. He's in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Panel, with the Tories consistently ahead in the polls, does that mean that we've given up on caring about corruption and sleaze in our politics?
Ghani.
I don't know what the political point is trying to land there is. I think people are concerned about issues that matter to them close to home, whether it's, how secure the kids are going to be on the streets, which is why it's imperative that we have, a London mayor that deals with crime. People are concerned about job security, so they want a party that's being able to deliver jobs. They want investment in infrastructure, and they know that we manage the economy well. I think these are the things that matter to people, and that's why
you're saying that corruption. You're saying that corruption doesn't matter to normal people.
That's not what I'm saying. I think the question was posed as that was. There's obviously the person who's posing that question is trying to relay a particular message, and people vote for lots of different reasons, but fundamentally people vote for parties that align with their values and that can offer them opportunity, and that's exactly what we're offering, and hopefully people will come out tomorrow and vote for us.
Briefly, Liz.
Truth matters, doesn't it? Because if you wander into the wonderful world of lies, anything can happen, but that's not the real world. If we haven't got truth, if politicians don't try to speak the truth, then everything slides.
Sarah?
Well, I really care, and I think a great deal of people do. And what I really object to is, the Conservatives trying to say that the only moral standard that matters is the ballot box, that it only matters if people, if people indicate that they care through their vote. I think there need to be absolute standards, and they need to be observed, and they need to be enforced. And I think I think the current government are falling a great way short of what's really required.
Charlie?
Echoing what Sarah said, Nuz said earlier on in the conversation, well, nobody's mentioning to her corruption, which I felt she was using as a justification for the sort of corruption which means the Prime Minister won't be straight on who paid for the repairs in Downing Street. The Conservatives will not explain why, if you were a friend of an MP or a minister, you got preferential treatment in relation to PPE contracts. They won't explain how it was that a banker got a pass to the Cabinet Office, then gave the former Prime Minister a job afterwards. That is corruption. And the fact that people inevitably are much more interested in COVID than they are in the detail of corruption does not make it acceptable. Okay. And when the pressure of COVID is gone, there will be a price this government pays.
Final quick text from Joanna in Sheffield. As photos surface of Tony Blair's mullet this week, what is the worst haircut the panel have had? See, whoever I come to first now, you're going to hate me. But I saw you on the television the other day, Liz, with a resplendent head of hair, which was a very nice shade of red. Now, you've got it hidden away from me on the screen at the moment, so I can't see if it's still the same shade, but I thought it was fabulous.
Thank you very much indeed. I think one of the difficult things for politicians who are supposed to look the same all the time. And finding myself of a certain age, I find that I don't look the same as I used to do a number of years ago. So my hair does some interesting things now, but it changes its colour every time I wash it. And I shall live with it because it interests me, but I'm sure for the rest of the world it's quite entertaining.
Well, it brightens up our lives. Sarah Olney, you've had the same haircut ever since I've known you.
I don't change my hair very often. I can think the only time I've had a real hair disaster was actually completely accidental. I remember I was about 14, 15. I got a curling tong stuck in the front, and I decided in my wisdom to cut them out because they were so hopelessly tangled. And I had a bald patch in the front of my head for about 6 months. It was awful. So that's why I don't mess with my hair. I leave it well alone.
At least it was only 6 months. Hey, yes. Nuz Ghani.
Well, can I say that I've been looking at Tony Blair's new hairdo, and I find it quite interesting. So I know everyone's taking huge offence by this so-called mullet.
So are you telling me you fancy Tony Blair?
No, I don't. I just think I'm not taking huge offence. It feels like everyone's taking huge offence and is comparing him to horrid things. I think it's an interesting look. He's not tied it up into a ponytail. That would just ruin it for me, Ian, if he did that. And worst hairdo, my husband has started cutting my hair. And so what I'm showing you today is down to my husband hair cutting it. So I suppose this is my worst period of hair, down to David's cutting
fine to
skills.
me. Charlie, if Tony Blair was still your flatmate, what would you be whispering in his ear, mate, get it cut?
No, I'd be saying, God, if only the lockdown would go on longer, you look more like Rick Wakeman than you do at the moment.
But you used to have quite a long hair at the back, didn't you?
I did, yeah, but that went away. I mean, during the lockdown, as you get old as a man, you get all this sort of grey hair growing out of your neck, which makes you look older and older. And during the course of the lockdown, I would from time to time try with an electric shaver to get rid of it, but only get rid of a bit of it. It would get worse and worse and worse. That is one reason that it's good that the lockdowns have come to an end, at least in the haircutting front.
Well, it's the hair that grows out of your nose and ears as you get older that's worse, as I'm sure everyone on the panel will agree. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. Nis Ghani, Sarah Olney, Liz Saville-Roberts and Charlie Falconer will be back with Cross Question next Wednesday at 8 as usual. You're listening to LBC. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, France is threatening to cut power supplies to Jersey after a row over post-Brexit fishing rights. It's because of conditions placed on French